Hi everyone, I'm Richard and welcome to my talk called Freqi for HalfStack. Thanks for joining. Freqi is a JavaScript library that generates frequencies for use in web audio projects. I'm going to explain why I made this library and what it can do. So yeah, buckle up because it's going to be an interesting journey as we walk through musical theory and programming challenges. A little bit about myself first. So I'm a web developer, but I'm also a musician, part-time musician that is. And over the years I've put out quite a few records. This is some of them, if not all of them. And yeah, the combination of my web developer skills and my interests and passion for music were combined into a project which I embarked on a few years ago called the Conditional Orchestra. And the Conditional Orchestra is a web app that converts weather data into music. I have explained the motivations and the thinking and the hard work and endeavour that went into that in another HalfStack talk, which took place last year. So you can see that online if you're interested. So I'm not going to talk too much about the Conditional Orchestra today, but I am going to talk about Freqi, which is an important component of it. So yeah, the Conditional Orchestra is just basically a web app that allows you to play the weather of where you are now. So you can listen to music that is generated by weather data from where you are now, or you can pick your own location. So you can effectively listen to the weather of anywhere in the world. So yeah, if you're interested in that, please feel free to go to theconditionalorchestra.com and listen to your weather. So when I was designing that application, and there was quite a lot to design, a lot more than I anticipated at the beginning, I wanted to be able to map data inputs from the weather service that I was using and use those inputs as outputs for my application. So to give an example, maybe like the nearest storm bearing, which is in degrees, could translate to the rate that the symbol plays. And then there are some kind of more sensible one-to-one mappings like visibility, for example. If that's 10 miles, then the filter frequency used is 300 hertz. So those are the kind of more simple mappings that I wanted to achieve in my application. There was a lot more complex logic that went into it in order to make the music as organic as possible, and also to ensure that it evoked the weather of that particular place. But that was where I started with my thinking. So you kind of have two choices when you're dealing with music in a digital scenario anyway. And your choices basically boil down to two things really. So you have oscillators. So these are the things which generate sound, computed sound, and an oscillator essentially can have two key properties really: the shape of the wave. So, for example, a square wave, which is the shape that it's described by. So it's pretty much a square, and the frequency in hertz. So audio files, which most people will be familiar with, which is just a file that you play back from disk and plays at a standard speed and a constant speed, and generally that isn't amended or changed in any way. Of course, if you are making digital music in a piece of digital audio software, then you'll be used to pitching audio files up and down. That's basically what a sampler is good for. But with web audio, dealing with audio files and pitching them up and down isn't necessarily super common, or at least it wasn't when I was designing the Conditional Orchestra. So I started looking for some libraries that could help me build the musical engine. And one such library is Tone.js. I actually use P5 for quite a lot of the conditional orchestra's logic, but yeah, Tone.js is actually, I believe, part of that library. But Tone.js and P5, they're great at allowing you to sequence, and they are really useful if you want to just pump in some notes, giving the notes or determining the notes by their letters. But they don't necessarily do some of the things that I wanted to do. So I kind of got to that point where I didn't really know how I was going to achieve what I wanted without having to make something. So yeah, I mean, I might have been in some situations where I wanted to create a sound using an oscillator and set the frequency in hertz, or play a particular note using a letter. But then there were other situations where I wanted to actually just use numbers, basically, intervals, as in the intervals equating some notes on a keyboard. And I also obviously wanted to be able to use audio. So, excuse me. The reason I wanted to use audio is because audio files can contain a lot of sonic information that's really difficult to achieve with oscillators. You can combine oscillators and you can play sounds together, and you can do all kinds of sophisticated things to create an interesting timbre or texture. But I wanted to create those sounds as much as possible in my my DAW, my digital audio workstation, and then bring that into my project and pitch those sounds up and down and to play my melodies. So I used, in the end, for the conditional orchestra, a combination of oscillators and web audio, and audio files. But as I say, I was kind of stumped on how I was actually going to do that, because none of the libraries out there that I look for seem to do both, or seem to allow me to work in the way that I wanted to. So this is where the motivation for Freqi came from. And I was quite pleased, just as a side point, about getting the name Freqi on GitHub and on NPM. So yeah, that was a bit of a winner. So the motivation, just to reiterate, was generate frequencies based on arrays of intervals for use in a sequencer. So I was going to use something else, basically P5, Tone.js or whatever, to do the sequencing. But I wanted to be able to take data and use that data numerically to create arrays of intervals or notes that were going to play in my melodies. And I needed those notes to be absolute or relative numbers so that I could use them with oscillators and audio files. So that's what I started making. So the very, very most basic way in which this API would work is to have a start frequency, so let's say 440 Hertz, which is the equivalent of the note A, and then I would basically give a function an array of intervals -3, 0, which is the root note, 440, 5, 7, could be anything, any whole number, positive or negative. And then the output of that would be the frequencies that I need. So here you can see that those are the frequencies that I would get out the other side based on, well, a formula that we'll come to shortly. And this is an example of what happens when you give Freqi a frequency of 1, which is the playback rate of an audio file. So you can give it this array of intervals, and out of the other side you get your array of frequencies. So that is basically all it's supposed to do in its most simplistic way. But of course, when you're making anything like this, it's never entirely simplistic, is it? So what I realized is, despite being a musician for however long, 20 years or more, that maybe like a lot of non-classically trained musicians, I didn't actually really know my music theory as well as I thought. And I had to go off on a considerable tangent to understand how I was actually going to realize what I've just described. And there are two, I guess, primary systems for for calculating frequencies and for creating tuning systems. So, you know, next time you pick up a guitar or play a piano, yeah, just spare a thought for all the people who've gone before, who've done all the mathematics behind the tuning system that made those things possible, because it's not quite as trivial as everyone would like to think. So, first up, just intonation. So this is systems based on the harmonic series. Some of you may have heard of the harmonic series or be familiar with it. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. That is how sound works in nature, effectively. And then there is equal temperament, which is basically a completely human devised system for avoiding kind of bad sounding notes or chords that sound out of tune, and enabling easy keyboard mapping. So this system is super useful, flexible, portable, other words that end in able. So I decided, for the sake of the conditional orchestra and to keep my my life and my application as simple as possible, to go for equal temperament. So having looked into it, I thought, yeah, this is for me. This is going to be the thing that makes the music probably sound, you know, correct, and at the same time make it fairly straightforward for me to generate all the frequencies I want. And here is the algorithm, basically. So I'll just briefly describe what's happening here. So we have our start frequency, and then we multiply that by essentially 2 to the power of our interval. So let's say I want the third note in the sequence, 2 to the power interval divided by the number of semitones in an octave. And to go downwards, do the same thing, except this time you divide the start frequency by the output of that calculation. And I'm hoping what some of you have noticed here is that as soon as you have the algorithm for something, you have a lot of power and a lot of control. So rather than me just putting in the letters for some notes that I want, I now actually have a formula which allows me to generate the intervals I want, but also decide how many semitones I want to use in an octave. And this was a bit of a revelation for me. So it allowed me to think beyond Western scales, or beyond the 12-note scale at least. And so by specifying the number of semitones, and I've highlighted that in italics because it is one of the config properties that you have that you can play with. By specifying that as 19, for example, you can use the 19 equal temperament system, or another name for it is the extended third comma mean tone. Catchy, right? And similarly, you can use the quarter tone scale, which is 24-note system used in Arabic music. Basically, you can kind of do whatever you want with it, and that's fun. And I use that to my advantage in the conditional orchestra. So I'm going to play a little demonstration of the conditional orchestra now. What you're about to hear, you know, it's not Mozart, it's not Miles Davis, but it does hopefully evoke the weather, which was kind of the point of that app. So what you're about to hear is the conditional orchestra playing when the temperature of the weather in that particular place, which is Greenland, is below 0 and the wind speed is more than 25 kilometers an hour. So pretty nasty, bitter conditions. So you can hear that it's quite discordant. So obviously the way that octave has been divided means that some of the notes sound quite out of tune or detuned compared to most of the music that anyone probably listens to, which, as I say, was from a creative perspective the idea. So you'll only actually hear that music when the weather is particularly bitter and particularly cold. The point being that the freedom I was afforded by being able to divide the octave was creative freedom. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that there are two primary musical systems, just intonation and equal temperament. But what I want to do in this talk is make sure that we talk about just intonation, because this is somewhat overlooked. Nearly everything that you probably hear on the radio, at a gig, anywhere these days, is made with equal temperament. Nearly, or certainly most modern instruments, particularly anything digital, will be using a system like that. But just intonation is still real. It's still out there. As I say, it's how nature works. It's still how a lot of instruments work or can work. Yeah, it's something that I wanted to explore and consider. So once I'd finished the conditional orchestra, I started researching this in more detail. And as I mentioned, just intonation is based on the harmonic series, which we'll look at in just a second. Common systems within just intonation are the diatonic systems, the 5-limit, Pythagorean, and that's what we'll look at now. Or at least that's what we'll look at on the slide after this. But I did promise you that we would look at the harmonic series. So the harmonic series is, it's basically how vibrations work in nature. So the most simple way I can explain this, for the purposes of this talk, is that if you multiply or divide a frequency using a whole number ratio, a note is pitched up or down. So for example, halving the frequency of a given pitch will bring that same note down an octave. So C3 becomes C2 if you halve that frequency. Doubling it will take you to C4. One little thing I want to make sure that we don't overlook here, and that avoids any confusion about the diagram on the right hand side, is that, and I'm hoping some of you will remember this from your physics at school, is that when you actually halve the wavelength rather than the frequency, right, if you halve the wavelength, it will actually double the frequency, because the frequency and wavelength of a wave are inversely proportional. So yeah, what you're seeing on the right, if you're seeing if you take note of the second one down, where it's being halved, that is half of the wavelength. So these systems, these just intonation systems, they were created by, well, numerous different people. I briefly mentioned a few of them. Pythagorean is the one that we will look at. And these different approaches, well, they used various different mathematical approaches, each person or each sort of culture that created these. And they're not perfect in many ways. I mean, they all have their inherent mathematical problems and challenges. There isn't really time in this talk to go into some of the mathematical challenges, but I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to have a read up online. As an example of how notes were created in these scales, I would say that the Pythagorean system is one of the most interesting ones. Basically, in all of these systems, there are problem notes, and they just get randomly sort of discarded based on how good they sound. So yeah, basically, what sounds nice to us, and how sound works in nature, and then how our instruments are actually made and sound good to us. Those things don't all entirely add up. That's the topic of another talk, perhaps. So the Pythagorean system, which I've illustrated here, is this series of ratios, and as you can see, there's some pretty big numbers in there. So he used ratios involving only the powers of 3 and 2, and these tended to involve some really, really large numbers, and because those numbers are so large, they're incredibly rare in actual physical phenomena. But I decided to adopt these and to basically bring them into Freqi. So in version 1.1, which I only released fairly recently, developers and musicians who are interested in playing with this can now generate sequences of notes in either equal temperament, which is what it supported for most of its lifetime, or now one of these just systems. So I have taken all of the ratios that are in those systems, put them into arrays, and use them in some functions I wrote, which are going to calculate all the notes for you that you could possibly want in any octave. So just a quick look at the Freqi API. So there's a mandatory argument, one mandatory argument, which is the intervals. If you don't provide any intervals, you don't get any music. So yeah, you can put in as many as you like, basically, and it will give you those frequencies back. The optional arguments, and I've mentioned the start frequency a few times. That's a pretty good thing to enter. By default, it will use 440, which is the note A. But I encourage you to use whatever note or whatever key it is you want to generate your music in. The number of semitones per octave I mentioned earlier as well, so that's a great parameter to play with. And the mode. So the mode is a string, which is short form for one of those musical systems. So now I have some examples that I wanted to play you of some interesting experiments I've been doing with Freqi since 1.1. And so what we're about to hear is a 3-note chord generated using the 22 Shrutis tuning system. That is a tongue twister. And the 22 Shrutis system is an ancient Indian system. I'm finding it really fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to making some music with it. So I've picked for this example the intervals 0, 2, and 5. So let's have a listen. So you can hear that kind of sounds maybe like a ray gun from a 1950s B movie, but it's quite a cool sound, right? I mean, those are the kind of sounds that I tend to come across when I'm making music, using what's known as frequency modulation. And the next example is another good one of exactly that. So this is the way in which those different frequencies that are very close together interact. Okay, so this example is basically the same thing. It's another 3-note chord, but I've just moved one of the notes a bit closer. So now it's 0, 2, and 4. And you can hear that sounds even less harmonious, but again, kind of really interesting. And then finally for this section, 3 notes again, this time 0, 1, and 2. So this is as close as these notes can get. And as I say, remember that there's 22 of them in an octave. So in that example, and I'm not sure whether it's coming across to all of you watching, because obviously this is being done as a video. And therefore you're not going to get the benefits of hearing it actually in a venue where we would have a good sound system, and you'd be able to hear some of the details in there. But it kind of sounds like one note is just warbling, and that's because they're so close. They're creating that kind of sonic effect. And then I wanted to demonstrate an example of listening to a simple scale, so the notes A, C sharp, E, G sharp, and A, using 3 different tuning systems at the same time. So this is kind of basically illustrating the point that equal temperament and the Pythagorean system and the 5-limit system have some differences. Basically, you get slightly different frequencies. So you should have noticed that the second note, as one example, kind of sounded a bit wobbly again, a bit detuned, didn't sound entirely clean, and that's because the different tuning systems are actually playing different frequencies. And that's what's kind of interesting to me about these different systems, is they all try to find a harmonious way to allow a musician to play music. But they all have these subtle differences, and actually in just systems some of these differences get really exaggerated when you play in different keys. So, to summarise what Freqi can now do, you can create melodies for oscillators or audio files. It's been able to do that actually since its inception. And you can create complex melodies, huge arrays of more complex melodies by actually offsetting the root note at some point, or offsetting the actual interval in the array that you have. And when dealing with arrays of arrays, this can be really useful. You can then play with inversions. For those of you that are into your music, you can experiment with microtonal music. So these different tuning systems are going to allow you to essentially generate unusual harmonics. You can play melodies in a range of just tuning systems, as I explained, or you can basically create your own tuning system using the equal temperament setting. Pump in as many or as few notes in an octave as you like, and have fun with the results. So just a little bit about what it was made with. I mean, it actually has no dependencies at all when you install the library. But on the dev side of things, I use TypeScript. I actually only switched it to TypeScript in the last 6 months or so. But I was doing a lot of type checking in my unit tests, and I wanted to cut that down and make it a little bit easier to read. So yeah, I switched to TypeScript. I use Rollup, which, and some of you might find this a bit controversial, is my preferred bundling tool. I like the ASM support. I use Chai and Mocha for my unit tests. And I use Travis as my CI tool, and Codacy as my code quality monitor. It's a really nice tool. It's a really good alternative to Sonar. Plays nice with ESLint and your preferred rule sets. So what are my plans for Freqi? Well, my plans are to add support for note names. Since everyone else is doing it, I suppose I better do it at some point. So I will get round to that. And actually, to think just beyond the West, I should probably include support for the Indian note names too. And I'm going to add support for some other tuning systems. So there's Zalino's 16-note system, which I think he designed for a harpsichord, which is strange and interesting. And I'm going to add support for truly just systems. So what I mean is I'm going to attempt to write an algorithm based on the Pythagorean principle or one of them, which actually creates a sequence of notes out of a given formula rather than an array of predefined ratios. So those are my plans for it, but I'm open to suggestions if anyone's got any. So one final example. I used equal temperament, as I said earlier, in the making of the conditional orchestra. And I used 12 and 18 and 24 note systems depending on what the weather was. You'll mostly hear 12 notes because, generally speaking, the weather is reasonably clement. So unless you're in the middle of, and fortunate enough to be in the middle of a hurricane or such like, you're probably going to hear a 12-note scale. Here is some more pleasant weather than you heard before. Yeah, thanks for listening, everyone. I hope that was informative, and I hope it was inspiring in some ways, because I'm really, really curious to know what people are making with Freqi. I've seen that I get a few, a few downloads a day on npm. So there's definitely people using it out there. But yeah, love to hear from you if you're using it, and if you're interested in using it, the links are below. Yeah, thanks so much for joining. So long.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. That was an amazing deep dive into music theory there. I feel like I've learned a huge amount. And lovely to see you again, fellow speaker from last year's HalfStack London.
Indeed. Yeah, nice to see you again. Slightly different circumstances.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned that you were classically trained. What's your musical background, and what got you into mixing music and technology?
Well, firstly, I just need to say that I'm not classically trained. What I was saying in my talk was that I definitely skipped that part of my education, sadly, and have basically sort of self-classically trained by building Freqi and learning all that music theory. But yeah, what got me into it? Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose my parents were fairly musical, and I played guitar and stuff when I was quite young and things. But yeah, when I got a bit older and I got into more experimental music. Yeah, I just wanted to get my hands on things that help you make music. So I used every single penny I had from Christmas and birthdays to buy a 4-track recorder, which was like the most amazing tool in the world at the time. Yeah, that was an education in itself, because you had to kind of bounce the tracks around to make more tracks. So my God, yeah, I don't miss that in a way, but it was a learning curve.
I think so. I've got quite a musical background, and for me, it was mini discs playing that part of a multi-track recorder. But enough about me. There's a whole load of capabilities in web browsers today around music and audio and all that kind of stuff. But to my knowledge, there's not a huge amount of audio libraries. Is that true? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it is true. Yeah, I mean, I think the web has become. The web became very quickly quite visual, understandably, and I feel like kind of sound and the use of sound and music and stuff has kind of been designed out of it in a way. It's kind of seen as an irritation, isn't it? And that's a little bit
for everyone. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's another thing that I don't necessarily miss, actually. Flash. Yeah, I remember those days. But yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, someone said, I think it was a typographer said, 99% of the web is type. So it's a very visual medium, and a lot of the content is text. And I guess when it comes to kind of making music or playing with music, I guess like desktop and native.
Oh, we lost
Richard.
Fallen foul to the tea time internet rush.
Oh no.
No, we'll give him a moment. Tony, tell us about your musical background.
So I did a music GCSE, and every single performance was me rapping Dr. Dre songs.
Nice.
Yeah, which as a 15-year-old white kid meant there was a lot of editing involved in being able to submit those to the exam body.
The inverse of that is, did you see the recent video of Snoop Dogg going into his car and listening to Let It Go as a way to like chill out? He's just listening to like Let It Go. He's just like,
oh my God,
I just gotta do this. I just gotta chill. It's hilarious. It's like 5 minutes of Snoop Dogg just sitting there, not singing along to Let It Go, just listening to Let It Go. And quarantine time, relaxation, right? So it's pretty funny.
I wished he was singing it.
Yes, but it was
Still
actually
cool.
more impressive that he wasn't, because it's like, gangster rapper appreciating Disney queen or princess music, right? So it's pretty funny.
I mean, that needs to be a duet, Ethan Mansell and Snoop Dogg.
I know, right?
Singing Let It Go. I need to see that.
Exactly. I'm not sure if we're going to get Richard back, but we definitely need to give him a couple minutes to see if that happens. But we have about 4 minutes to fill here, so
I'm super impressed with him getting the name Freqi. I think that is so brilliant.
And I did not think that's what it was called until I heard his talk, and it made me laugh.
Right?
It's not the name I would have expected him to pick. I wish I was here to troll him about that, or he was here. Yeah.
What would you have picked, Dylan?
Well, no, I don't know. I'm terrible at naming things. I don't name anything well. Like when I tried to come up with the name for Dojo, we came up with like shiny marbles, and that was terrible. And then someone else came along and was like, because it was like modular blocks, and we were like, how about modules? Like just really bad names. And actually, one of the names we joked around was Node years ago, like 10 years before Node came out. We're like, no, that sounds like a cancerous disease. We can't use that as a name. That's like the name of an API. Why would you call your thing Node? That's just like disease ridden. And now it's like, the most popular JavaScript thing ever. So there's always fun stories like that, right? Yeah.
Damn, you could have registered all those handles and made all that money.
Well, then they would have just called it something better, I guess. Like Dino or something, right? Anyhow, I think, let's see, we have 2 minutes of space here. This is unusual.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's such a shame. I would love to
Yeah, that's okay.
ask him about whether or not he could use it to read or write music. Like, I feel like there are so many things that you could do with it now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely been using it to, like, create obvious, like, or non-obvious, but just different oral ways to analyze things that might, like, and he was kind of about to talk to this point, I think, which was that sometimes we don't use audio on the web very much, but we could use it to, like, see patterns that aren't obviously visual. So actually, Rene Rubalcaba, who I think is in the audience, he gave a talk at a couple of the other HalfStack events called Listening to Maps. And what he did was he took like maps and like income disparity. And like if the income disparity was large in an area, it would make a loud thumping noise. And if it was like fairly equal, it would make a nice soothing noise. And just a way to like look at visualized data in multiple dimensions. And music is a way to add that, because you can't stack 5 dimensions into a curve, but you can add like 5 dimensions with music, but different sounds, and hear different trends. There's a lot of cool things you can do with audio in the web.
I remember a while ago somebody turned your GitHub squares, so your green squares, into musical chords. And so they made a little Chrome extension that was "Sing Me the Song of Your GitHub."
Yep. Richard's here in time for us to say goodbye. So, at least it wasn't my computer that crashed, because the whole conference would have gone down, or my network connection, I mean. Knock on wood. Anyway, it was a beautiful talk, Richard. Thanks so much. And I'm sure people have questions in the chat that we didn't get to answer. So up next is Ada Rose Cannon. Thanks, Richard.
Cheers, Richard. The cat's